The gentleman from New York, Mr. Maloney, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of my bill, H.R. 357, the Human Trafficking Prevention Act. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Mr. Royce and Mr. Cicilline, and my co-sponsors. And I'd like to acknowledge Majority Leader McCarthy for his leadership on taking up this legislation at the beginning of this new Congress. You know, no matter what part of the country you're from, human trafficking is an issue that we have to address now because lives are at stake. The State Department estimates that millions of children, women and men, are trafficked each year and forced into modern-day slavery as part of an evil and fast-growing industry. We know that the crime of human trafficking is dramatically underreported, and most of it happens invisibly. Therefore, a critical part of the work we are doing today is to bring human trafficking out in the open so we can raise awareness and prevent it from happening to more of the world's most vulnerable populations. We must also remember that this happens right here in our communities, all across our own country. Behind all of these numbers and statistics, there are real faces and real stories of women, men, and too often children. Women like Mandy Palmer of Western New York, who 4 years ago met a man named Ryan online. Ryan was not who he pretended to be. Ryan turned out to be a human trafficker, a pimp, who forced Mandy into prostitution and threatened her family. New York continues to be one of the top hubs of human trafficking, where sex trafficking, child labor, and indentured servitude happen all too frequently. Just one organization in New York, Safe Horizon, has worked with more than 600 victims in recent years. In the Hudson Valley, we've seen it in Newburgh, in Poughkeepsie, places like Wappingers Falls, places like New Windsor, and even small villages like Pound Ridge. Story after story tells us this disgusting, this horrifying practice of modern-day slavery happens right here, right in our own neighborhoods, in our own backyards. Just 10 days ago, authorities took action against a major sex trafficking ring in Albany, New York. 9 women who had traveled here from a foreign country were forced into prostitution at 4 different massage parlors. In another community in the Hudson Valley, about an hour away from New York City, a man tricked teenage girls to travel to the United States on tourist visas from countries like Brazil, Hungary, and France. He instructed these women to lie to both immigration and State Department officials in order to gain access to our country. It is precisely this type of situation that my legislation seeks to stop. We must ensure that our men and women on the front lines of our borders have the resources and training they need in order to identify and stop human trafficking at its source, before these women, children, and men enter the United States, out of their own culture, away from their own language many times, and become isolated and become victims. As part of our goal to end human trafficking, we can make sure that our Foreign Service officers and other government personnel have the tools and training they need to spot and to identify these victims and to stop this trafficking across international borders. In the past, the State Department estimated that between 14,000 and 17,000 foreign nationals were trafficked into the United States every single year. Although the federal government has a zero-tolerance policy on human trafficking, our Foreign Service officers, who often have face-to-face contact with these victims when they're obtaining U.S. visas, currently undergo minimal training to define, identify, and recognize the indicators of this human trafficking so they can stop it at the source. So my legislation would expand new minimum training procedures for Foreign Service officers and other government personnel in order to identify and stop this human trafficking before people cross these boundaries and end up in our own communities, before it becomes too late, when they're here and victimized. And we know criminals will do just about anything to adapt to our new methods and to avoid getting caught, so this bipartisan legislation also requires annual updates to keep on top of key problems, threats, and the new methods, and to identify new warning signs of trafficking. I want to thank my colleagues across the aisle because by working together we have a new opportunity to come together to combat this monstrous practice of trafficking in children, women, and men. Victims of human trafficking cannot wait another day. And so today we have an opportunity to do something together to combat this growing problem. Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to support my legislation, H.R. 357, the Human Trafficking Prevention Act. I thank you and I yield back.